We're about to kick off a multiple-part set of videos about the ethics of photojournalism. And namely, this is going to be split into two general parts. The first being about the ethics of working in the field as a photojournalist and how you handle stressful situations. The other is going to be about the ethics of publishing hard-to-stomach photographs or difficult-to-process photographs. Just as a general warning, I will add before all of the videos in this series, some of the examples we will use as a part of these videos will include some graphic images and some very sad situations. So that stuff makes you uncomfortable. Please know that before going in, that this will be a part of these lessons. From the get-go, it's crucial that we understand the power that we have as photojournalists, and we do have an immense level of power here. I would say even more so than traditional reporters. It's a power that we have to hurt people, potentially, to make them uncomfortable, to hurt them emotionally. It's also the power that we have to help people, either directly or indirectly, by bringing people's attention to things they otherwise would not have paid attention to. Because when it comes down to it, humans have been relying on visual images for about 15,000 more years than written text, through the images or use of artwork, drawings, eventually to photography. Imagery is inherently a part of who we are as people and how we communicate and how we bring about information to each other. So images are powerful. When we sort of colloquially will say something like, a picture's worth 1,000 words, you can spend immense amount of time reporting on something and not capture something as powerful as this. There is lots of reporters writing about the democratic uprising in China. None of those stories are all that remembered, but everybody has seen this photograph called Tank Man, or at least one like it. There's lots of photographers there who captured a photograph very similar to this of a defiant man standing in front of a row of tanks refusing to move. It's one of those things that, again, this is ingrained in human society way more than any written story is. So that really gives us a big sense of the power that photojournalism can have as a lasting icon, as well as a way to bring people's attention to things. Which brings us to our first lesson here, and I think it's a powerful one, and it's an important one if you're going to get involved in photojournalism, and that is that you have to emotionally know what you're getting into, and that you have to know if you're going to tackle important and hard-to-stomach situations in this world visually, you're going to have to prepare yourself to deal with them, and that's not always very easy. So, as an example of how two people have had similar situations and how they've emotionally dealt with it differently, we're going to look at two different winners of the Pulitzer Prize over time and their two stories. The first is an Associated Press photographer named Nick Ut. He was in Vietnam during the Vietnam War and was a press photographer sending photographs back to the office in Los Angeles. He was a very good photographer at the time, well known. He was traveled all around Vietnam, taking pictures of the war effort, largely from the South Vietnamese side. He was embedded with the South Vietnamese army. He's following them on a raid into a village when word came across the radio that the South Vietnamese Air Force had incorrectly bombed a civilian village with napalm. Napalm being a very sticky substance that catches on fire really easily and was used to firebomb areas in the Vietnam War. The crew that he's with the South Vietnamese army, starts approaching the village that was incorrectly bombed with napalm, and he sees a bunch of kids running down the road. A lot of them had their clothes burned with the napalm. He notices there was a little girl whose clothes had been nearly burned off. She had torn the rest of them off, and he snapped a photograph. The photograph came to be known as Napalm Girl. This is the very iconic image some of you may have seen in history textbooks before. Certainly you've most likely seen it up to a point. At this point, just in talking about the history of the Vietnam War. So he snaps the photograph of the girl. And what he does next ends up sort of making the difference here. So he snaps the picture. He then walks the girl personally to a military ambulance. He wraps her in a blanket, gets her in the ambulance. He helps the soldiers nearby give her water, hops in the ambulance, and rides with her in the ambulance back to the hospital in the closest town. Ended up staying with her until the doctors got her stabilized in the hospital before going back to his office and getting the photographs ready to send them to the Associated Press. Now, there was a lot of debate about whether or not to publish these photographs, but we will talk about that at another time on our conversation on ethics. It turns out that the Associated Press did send these photographs off to be published. They got published very widely, and this was as public attention was starting to sort of turn against the Vietnam War. We were questioning a lot of what we were actually doing there, and the Associated Press ended up getting a lot of attention for this photograph. He ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1973 for spot news photography. And the photograph was actually called The Terror of War, even though everyone knows it as Napalm Girl. But that's not the end of the story. He wins the Pulitzer Prize, and he actually keeps going back to the hospital to check on the girl. He travels back about once a year and checks on her to make sure she's doing okay, helps her family out with expenses. And it turns out that the two actually stayed good friends and still to this day are very good friends. He still visits her. She lives in the United States now, and they have since remained very good friends. Nick, by the way, still is an active photographer at age 66. He still works for the Associated Press at the Los Angeles Bureau, still takes photographs, and has lived a long life as a photographer. As a matter of fact, there's another famous photograph he took that got sort of widespread in the mid-2000s that you may have seen, very different from his first famous photograph, and it was a photograph of Paris Hilton crying in the back of a police car after having to go to jail. So that's the story of Nick Ut. Took a very famous but very difficult to look at photograph of a child suffering severe burns, helped the child get to the hospital, was able to see through the process of the kid getting better, stayed friends with the person the rest of their lives and still are friends. Compare and contrast this situation with Kevin Carter. Kevin Carter is another Pulitzer Prize winning photographer. He was a freelance photographer from South Africa. He worked for a lot of different publications as a freelancer, but mainly worked for the Johannesburg Star, which was the big daily newspaper in Johannesburg, South Africa. That's a picture of Kevin Carter there to the right. Carter was a part of a group of photographers that called themselves the Bang Bang Club. They were four photographers who were largely based out of South Africa, but traveled around Africa during a period of time where a lot of countries were undergoing sort of violent changes of government. It was also during a period of time where the government in South Africa was transitioning away from apartheid and was going through some growing pains. And so there was lots of revolution. There was lots of violence happening around a lot of different countries in Africa. They named themselves the Bang Bang Club because they were going and covering places, one, where a lot of other Western photographers were not going, were not paying attention to. So they were often the only ones there. The name specifically comes from the fact that the four of them found themselves getting shot at a lot. And so they sort of gave themselves the humorous nickname because they thought it was funny how many times they'd had to dodge bullets as photographers. The other members were Osterbrook, who was a good photographer, Sylvia, and Marinovich. More about how they turned out in a second. Kevin Carter there also pictured. And in 1993, Kevin Carter was traveling with a United Nations mission, and their goal was to drop food off at remote villages in Sudan. At the time, Sudan was going through a really terrible famine, and there was widespread starvation going on. And he was told, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to stop these planes in these villages. We're going to land the plane. We're going to distribute the food. While we're distributing the food, you get out, go take pictures of whatever you want to take pictures of. But you have to get back here by the time the plane takes off again, otherwise you're going to get left, or do we have to keep on schedule here? He was also specifically told, look, these folks are undergoing famine. These are also a lot of people who don't have a lot of visitors from the outside world. So don't interact with people, don't touch people, you might share some viruses or germs that they're not conditioned to. Try to keep hands off as much as possible. So he is wandering around the area. Close by, he notices that there is a starving girl trying to get to the area where they're distributing the food. And he notices that kind of near where she is a manure pile where there's a lot of vultures around. And one of the vultures has hopped over sort of near the girl. And so he takes this photograph. He spends a little bit of time getting the angle right. He takes the photograph of the vulture looming in the background, sort of near the girl who's trying very desperately to make her way to the food station. He then gets up, he shoos the vulture away, and goes back to the station to get back on the plane to leave. He, again, snapped the picture, shooed the bird away, and moved on. And a lot of people have questioned him since then of, how did you not help the girl get to the food station? At the time, people questioned him. And one thing that never really came out in the popular conversation about this is that he was under very specific instructions to not touch anyone in order to prevent spreading viruses to people who already might have their immune systems incredibly weakened. Another part of the conversation about all of this is that although Kevin Carter had taken a lot of difficult pictures of covering warfare for a while, he had never really taken pictures of a famine before, and so he was in a daze. He was shocked. People who were with this photographic assignment with him said that he almost seemed like he was out of it the whole time. He was just wandering around and couldn't really get a firm grasp on the emotional state of it. He gets back to South Africa. He files the photographs of the famine, and he wins the 1994 Pulitzer Prize for feature photography for covering, for that photograph as well as others that were covering the famine in Sudan. And a lot of newspapers ran his photographs. And this was also the first time that a lot of people who were reading these newspapers were even learning about famine in Africa, learning about famine in Sudan specifically. So the New York Times, for example, runs this photograph and are flooded with phone calls. They have people answering for the phone night and day, and people are calling in and asking, who was this girl? How can we help her out? Did the photographer help her out? How can we do something about this? We want to know more information about what happened. And people were shocked that Carter, for example, hadn't got the girl's name. He took the picture, shooed the bird away, and moved on. People were shocked and outraged that he didn't help the girl get to the food station, that he had lined up the shot instead of scaring the buzzard away to start with. People really blamed him. People were really very against him after the popularity of this photograph came out. People thought it represented the callousness of journalists, the callousness and heartlessness of photojournalists in taking pictures of the third world, ignoring the fact that he was specifically instructed not to touch anyone and also was mentally in very much of a daze. And this story does take a really bad turn here because after he wins the Pulitzer Prize and is challenged on how he took the photograph, he becomes very deeply depressed. He kind of got consumed by the guilt of it and ended up, about 3 months after winning the Pulitzer Prize, committing suicide. He just simply couldn't handle the depression and the pressure of what had happened. He ended up writing in his suicide note that, quote, "I'm haunted by the vivid memories of killings and corpses and anger and pain, of starving and wounded children." So he even very specifically referenced that it was this situation that caused him to be incredibly depressed. And it was tough for him. This is something that is actually sort of, now that we've come full circle, there's been a lot of writing about how, there was still ethical questions about how he handled it, but it wasn't entirely his fault. And there was a really good write-up by a writer named Leslie Neal who last year wrote an article called "How Photojournalism Killed Kevin Carter," that it was the kind of the pressures that photojournalists are put into that weighed so heavily on him. And he couldn't handle the situation. And that's not necessarily his fault. But compare and contrast his situation versus Nick Ut's situation in Vietnam. How one of them was able to stay close to the person they saw as the victim, whereas the other one wasn't. They were hurried back on a plane and put on a track to another village. And that situation differently weighed on them differently, and they were able to handle it and process it differently. There's no pure way of doing this. I'm not sitting here telling you have to always do one thing or the other. Remember, the point of the lesson here is to know emotionally what you're getting yourselves into, because photojournalism is a very emotionally taxing thing. It is very, very difficult the more that you take pictures of hard to deal with situations, of struggle situations, which you'll do in this class, of things that are depressing and hard to deal with. Just so you know how other members of the Bang Bang Club, what happened to them, Ken Osterbrook ended up being shot and killed about a year later after Ken Carter had died. He was reporting on a violent clash between police and a rival political faction in South Africa and was killed. The general consensus is that it was him being shot by the police accidentally that killed him. Sylvia ended up being a really wonderful conflict reporter, spent decades taking pictures of conflict zones, of war zones, of poverty and famine, became a very, very big name in the photojournalism world. Ended up in Afghanistan taking pictures of the sort of aftermath of the war in Afghanistan, of people who were trying to rebuild. Ended up embedded with some troops, ended up stepping on a roadside landmine, did lose both of his legs, but after recuperating and learning how to walk on his new legs, still is a photographer and still takes pictures. There's a photograph of him to the right there meeting President Obama. He followed Obama around for a while and took some really great pictures of him during his first year in office. Marinovich ended up writing a book about everybody in this sort of Bang Bang Club group, sort of as little biographies as well as their experiences covering war and famine and unrest in Africa. It's a really good book if you're into journalism and you're into stories of journalism, and if you're into photojournalism, really, check out this book. It is a really great a book. They also turned this into a movie called The Bang Bang Club that's not very good, but the book is really excellent. Now, all of that is to say this: it is impossible to ever know 100% what is right, because there's no such thing as absolutes when we're dealing with ethics. How Kevin Carter and how Nick Ut dealt with their two situations differently highlights not that one is absolutely right and the other was absolutely wrong. It's that different decisions can lead to different ways of having to think about and handle tough situations. All we can ever really do is go into this to arm ourselves with the understanding that bad things do happen in this world. People get hurt. People die, people starve, people are in bad situations, and that we're not always going to be able to directly help them. We're not always going to be able to step in and immediately make their lives better. But what we can do is capture their stories visually, which we already know is powerful and compelling. And we can present that to a higher audience. We can present that to people who may be able to do something about it. Someone who will look at your photo stories and decide that I want to go out and do something about this situation. I want to go out and help folks. And so what does this actually mean for you? Because realistically, not a lot of you are going to immediately get on a plane and go to a war zone and start taking pictures of conflict in the terms of a ground war or a civil war or a massive famine or something like that. So why would you care? It's because realistically, if you stick with photojournalism, you're going to find yourself in a tough situation, something that may make you uncomfortable, that may be hard for you to process. And these are things that are happening right next door. So we're in the middle of an opiate crisis. The use of painkillers, the use of heroin is skyrocketing in the United States. You may be asked to put together a photo story about this. You may have to talk to somebody who is an addict. And in the process of talking to somebody who's an addict or taking photos of someone or around someone who's an addict, you may inevitably be around someone as they try to get themselves high. And that's hard to deal with. And that's not something happening in a faraway land. That's something happening down the block from where you live. If you're ever dealing with poverty issues, they're incredibly difficult. A lot of photographers in the mid and late 2000s struggled a lot emotionally because they were covering the recession. And specifically, they were covering the direct impact of the recession, meaning they were covering people who were getting evicted from their homes. And they were there as people were literally losing their homes, as the bank sent people to collect all the stuff in their house and dump it out on the sidewalk in front of it to reclaim it. That's hard. That's really hard to be in that situation. But you have to prepare yourself before you go into it, knowing that what I'm going to do is capture this story, and I know that this story is a hard one. I know this is a story of someone losing their home. In the same way, dealing with any sort of widespread poverty issue is going to be dealing with folks who this is their life. And I think that that's another way of thinking about it, another way of going into it respectfully. We're going to talk more about this when we talk about your struggle assignment specifically. But just keep in mind that when you are a photographer going into an area to take pictures of a story about poverty in an area or income inequality in an area, know that you have somewhere else to go. And oftentimes they don't. This is their life. This is this source's life. So emotionally prepare yourself for that and understand that what you have is an immense power to tell their story to others. You may not be able to directly help them, but you can help them in other ways. So I know this is a tough subject and a tough situation, but I appreciate you paying attention, and we will pick this back up with Lesson 2.